Price of fuel, good news, has gone down as of midnight, bringing relief for motorists after months of an increase. And for reaction, I'm joined by Layton Beard from the Automobile Association. He's the spokesperson there. Layton, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. So this already is good news at the beginning of January. Could we perhaps expect another decrease later in this year?
Yeah, it certainly is good news, Seko, and I think from our perspective, we welcome it naturally. It'll have a big impact on a lot of people, and I think at the beginning of the year, it certainly, hopefully, sets a positive trend. Whether we're going to see this carrying on through February to December, I think is, well, it's very difficult to say right now, because the two main factors that influence the fuel price, the Rand-US dollar exchange rate and international petroleum prices, are obviously both very volatile and change on a daily basis. So we have to wait for those averages at the end of the month to come through before we get a picture of what's going to happen in the months ahead. Great news for now. What's going to happen in February going forward? Hopefully we'll see more of the same.
Layton, speak to us in layman terms around, you've just mentioned what influences the price of petrol, but just break it down for us for a clearer understanding.
So we're buying fuel on an international market, and obviously that cost is what we refer to as the international product price. If that's high, that's bad for us because that means we have to pay more to get it, and if it's lower, then obviously that has the reverse impact. We are paying for that in US dollars, and therefore the rand's value against the dollar needs to be measured. So when the rand-dollar exchange rate is low in favor of the US dollar, that's not great news for local consumers. But when the rand is stronger against the US dollar, then obviously that means that the value of the money that we're buying the product with is a lot better, and therefore it's going to have a good positive impact on local consumers.
Layton, can we say that the COVID-19 virus has had any impact at all on fuel prices?
Well, I mean, recently, obviously in 2020, it had huge impacts on the fuel price. Omicron at the moment may lead to a slowdown of demand as more people in the Northern Hemisphere contract the disease. That may result in fewer people going to work and needing to be transported, and that may have an impact on the international product price, on petroleum and demand. So it certainly, if that trend of Omicron continues, will have an impact. Again, it's a little too early to say what impact that's going to have going into February. It's a question of letting us see how this all plays out over the next couple of days.
Now, we do know that there's calls, and the AA is also part of that, for government to reduce the price of the fuel levy. Talk to us about that.
Well, we're not calling for a reduction in the fuel levy. What we are calling for is a review of the fuel price, and that the current levies not be increased as they are every year. The Minister of Finance gives his budget speech in February, and typically he announces increases to the fuel levies in that speech, and they come into effect in April. And we've said, let's not do that in 2022. Keep the prices as they are, at least until the review of the fuel price has been concluded. What we would like to see, Tseko, is a review of all the components of the fuel price, the way they are calculated, and an audit of all of those components. Once that has been done, then I think we as South Africans will have a clearer picture of whether there are any elements of the fuel price that can mitigate against the rise in fuel prices. We obviously would like to see that happen as soon as possible. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks, or even in his budget speech, the Minister of Finance gives some indication of whether or not that will actually happen or not.
So can you just then give us details? Of course, as you've mentioned, it is the review of the fuel price, that particular structure that you want for it to be reviewed. What is then the process in that? What would that entail besides the conversations that you've had possibly with the Finance Minister?
We haven't had any conversation with the Finance Minister. The Finance Minister himself has said in December that a relook of the fuel price may not be a bad idea, and I think obviously we agree with that approach. I think it's just understanding all of the components and why they costed at the way they are, whether there's any need to relook at those costs and whether there's a way that we can maybe minimize those costs. We certainly understand that you can't just do away with the general fuel levy, because that would mean that you need to get that tax through another source, an alternative source, and that may be difficult, especially because that is generating around 110 billion rand to the fiscus every year. So it's a question for us of understanding all of those elements. looking at what elements can be changed or what elements can be tweaked to bring down the cost of the fuel price, and at least having the conversation going forward, not just accepting month by month that this is what it is, without taking a deeper look at it.
Layton, you speak about these elements. What are these elements that you are referring to in this particular structure?
Well, there are many elements to the fuel price. You're looking at storage costs, you're looking at wholesale costs, you're looking at wharfage costs, you're looking at transport costs across the country. Certainly, you are also looking at the levies. You're looking at the equalization fund, the so-called slate levy. There are many elements to the fuel price that comprise the fuel price at the end of the day. And I think from our perspective, there is a need to relook at all of those elements and see whether they are all still appropriate for the South African market, and whether there's any way we can deal with them in a better way than what they are currently being dealt.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little, Layton, and ask from what you've just mentioned and all the elements that you've spoken about that go into the fuel price. What do you think is not working anymore for the South African market?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an unfair question in the sense that that's exactly what we want the review to actually determine. And I mean, we're not going to preempt the outcome of anything by saying that this is exactly what needs to go and this is what needs to stay. In our view, the review will actually look at all of those elements. It will do a determination of whether the elements are priced and costed correctly, and whether there's any way that those prices can come down. And I think that that's exactly the reason why we want this review to go ahead. It makes no sense for us to put on the table an ultimatum and say this must go and this must stay, when in fact government is the only entity that can make a difference to the fuel price locally. So I would not want to preempt that and answer that question in much detail.
Layton Beard there from the Automobile Association. Thank you so much for your time, really just giving us the good news around the drop in the fuel price.